Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Zoe Chevalier, and I'm the team leader for Syria A. I am here with Jesse Scott, our military expert, Nate Jones, our rebel expert, and Rebecca Van Pammel, our regional expert. And we are here to defend a realist solution to the position of the US in the Syrian conflict. Some have advocated for large intervention. We do not want to do that. The situation in Syria is a complex one. The status quo involves providing some funding and support to certain rebel groups in their fight against Assad, trying to fight ISIS, and all the while failing to provide a sufficient level of aid to refugees who are fleeing the country. These actions, taken together, are incompatible, not only with one another, but also with fundamental US interest. The primary US interest is regional stability. If we continue the current paradigm of US involvement in Syria, we risk the intensification and entrenchment of sectarian divides and the catastrophic humanitarian cost of the refugee crisis, as well as the strengthening of our global adversaries' positions in the region and the threat of the crisis expanding further. Military escalation exacerbates tension between us and Russia and antagonizes Iran at the risk of sacrificing our nuclear deal or increasing their funding of terrorist proxies. We would also risk losing the support of regional allies in other areas and creating terrorist safe havens. That does not justify taking all possible steps to stall the crisis. In the past decades, the US has proven itself capable of eliminating state leaders with whom it disagrees. However, we have also demonstrated a complete inability to replace them with effective and stable governments. US interventions have traditionally been followed by failed states, dangerous power vacuums, and civil chaos. Countries such as Iraq and Libya, lacking a stable government and with little prospect of prompt infrastructural improvement, have become breeding grounds for extremism and battlegrounds for proxies, manipulated by such rivals as Iran and Saudi Arabia. In the status quo, we are once again too involved in a conflict that is not in our direct interest, while not doing enough to protect the populations most in need. We must learn from past mistakes and avoid overextension in Syria if we are to prevent the conflict from degenerating into a similar quagmire. The US needs to balance these two outcomes. The conflict burning out will increase regional tensions and decrease stability, making the Middle East more dangerous and harder to govern. Intervention risks open-ended commitments to ineffective nation-building. We are not proposing a Goldilocks approach. There is no magical middle ground that will solve the crisis. Instead, we are providing concrete steps the United States should take that will shore up the rest of the region, limit the conflict spread, secure vital relationships, and protect vulnerable populations. Our concrete proposal is: number one, eliminate the Islamic State through collaboration with regional and global powers. Number two, end the funding to Syrian rebels. And finally, increase humanitarian aid. I will now turn it over to Jesse Scott, our military expert, who will explain to us the risk of major military intervention and outline the steps we can take to most effectively eliminate ISIS.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jesse Scott, and I'm going to explain the military outlook on the Syrian conflict, contextualizing recent events and regional forces with US policy options, and then outlining our counterterrorism strategy for combating groups such as ISIS. From a military perspective, one must understand three major points about the Syrian conflict. First, escalation and risking a military confrontation with Russia and Iran carries tremendous human, economic, diplomatic, and humanitarian costs. Second, currently tabled military options pose an unacceptable risk to American interests. And third, we are at a perfect juncture to eradicate a reeling ISIS. The United States possesses the most powerful military in the world, but Russia and Iran possess both the strength and resolve to match American military offensives in Syria. Russian mobilization in Syria has already involved several thousand ground troops, a fleet of 11 warships at the Tartus base, and over 50 aircraft. It is estimated that the Kremlin, in addition to supplying much of the Syrian army's equipment, spent over $65 billion in the first year of the conflict alone. This is not surprising, as Russia has arguably more at stake in Syria than the US. Russia sees Syria as integral to its goals of projecting power globally and perpetuating itself as a key Middle Eastern broker. Meanwhile, Iran also sees Syria as critical to its interests. Tehran has used the civil war to wage a proxy conflict with Saudi Arabia and serve its aspirations for regional hegemony. Tehran sees Syria as potentially the final piece of a swath of land stretching all the way from Iran to the Mediterranean Sea. Both states, Russia and Iran, have invested far too much to stand down in the event of a conflict. The military risk of a continued standoff with Russia and Iran is illustrated by two recent incidents where we have pushed the Russian position. On April 6th, the United States launched 59 Tomahawk missiles against the Shayrat airbase in response to Assad's chemical weapons attack. This was an unnecessary act and a diplomatic setback. It was indeed the first time that the United States has launched a direct military offensive against the Assad regime. This immediately increased the volatility of the Syrian civil war, and, in the bigger picture, it exacerbated US-Russia tensions. Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev even warned that the attack came within an inch of provoking a US-Russia military clash. He also criticized President Trump for reneging on his promises to establish a united US-Russia front against ISIS and other terrorist groups. Then, on June 19th, the United States shot down a Syrian aircraft, the first enemy plane to be shot down by America since the 1999 hostilities in Kosovo. Russia responded by disabling the Syrian deconfliction line, established to prevent collisions between the two countries' aircraft, and claiming that all American objects flying in Syrian airspace would be deemed as targets. Throughout this time, both Russia and the United States have escalated their airstrikes, with the US more than tripling its monthly airstrikes in the past 6 months. These have targeted not just ISIS, but also Assad-backed militia, creating a dangerous paradigm which, if continued, could push Russia past the brink of confrontation in defense of its regional interests and long-standing Middle Eastern ally. Syria is relatively peripheral to US interests, and we need to recognize that fighting Russia and Iran over it would carry disproportionate military, economic, and diplomatic costs. Thus, it is clear that direct military escalation is unpalatable. It is also crucial to understand that safe zones and no-fly zones are both untenable options. No-fly zones are tantamount to escalation due to the necessity of actually enforcing them, which would require the US to commit to shooting down violating aircraft, including Russian and Iranian planes. Meanwhile, safe zones offer a pick-your-poison choice. The 1995 Srebrenica massacre, a low point in the Bosnian conflict, emphasized that symbolic or minimal protection for safe zones is insufficient. On the other hand, vigorous protection of safe zones requires open-ended and intractable commitments. Safe zones in the Syrian maelstrom could be compromised at any time by such diverse actors as Assad, Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia, the Islamic State, Russia, and other rebel groups. Thus, US enforcement of safe zones would inevitably have massive economic and human costs. It would constitute the consummate example of a slippery slope, one that, through increasing funding to rebel forces, sending advisors to Syria, and escalating airstrikes, we have already been sliding down for years. The Pentagon has estimated that the maintenance of 2 safe zones would require 30,000 peacekeepers. In addition to posing a risk to American lives and raising the possibility of mission creep, such a step could breed extremism through exacerbating Middle Eastern views of America as the world's self-appointed policeman. The best choice we can make right now is to collaborate with Russia to eradicate ISIS. Indeed, no solution to the Syrian conflict can be possible without cooperation with Russia. ISIS has been steadily losing ground in Syria and Iraq. Some experts estimate that it lost 16% of its territory in 2016, and Raqqa is on the brink of falling as we speak. However, American attempts to balance attacks on the Assad regime with counterterrorism efforts have prevented the expeditious elimination of ISIS. Co-opting Russia into a concentrated air campaign against ISIS, while significantly enhancing intelligence sharing channels, is the most effective and least costly military means of defeating the terrorist group. We propose that the United States sustain its current number of airstrikes, but direct them exclusively against ISIS. As part of our strong opposition to boots on the ground, informed by past quagmires, we will not send any additional advisors or troops to Syria. Our 439 troops currently stationed in Syria will support our counterterrorism efforts and then return home after our goal of eradicating ISIS has been achieved. We should be able to cooperate in these counterterrorism efforts with Saudi Arabia and Turkey. In the wake of the recent terror attacks in Turkey, President Erdogan sees counterterrorism as a top priority as he seeks to strengthen his border, garner international approval, and consolidate domestic power. Erdogan stated in April that he was considering a broader initiative to follow his last airstrike campaign against ISIS. The U.S. cessation of funding for the YPG, removing a point of contention between Ankara and Washington, should provide additional incentive for Erdogan to move forward with this aggressive anti-ISIS strategy. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia, one of the U.S.'s closest Middle Eastern allies for decades, and a formidable military force itself, can also play a key role. The Saudis should be particularly interested in supporting tough counterterrorism measures, given their recent inflammatory rhetoric regarding Qatar. Mohammed bin Salman, recently promoted to Crown Prince, said this March that we are willing to do anything to eradicate terrorism, anything without limits. The Saudis have repeatedly expressed their willingness to send ground troops to Syria, troops which could work with Russia, the US, and Turkey to complete a final push against ISIS. Escalating the fight in Syria against Russia and Iran is a dangerous game with unacceptable military, economic, and diplomatic costs. Safe zones and no-fly zones wholly fail to account for the complexity and the enmity within the Syrian conflict. In contrast, multilateral cooperation with regional actors on counterterrorism efforts is the best pathway to an attainable goal which both protects American civilians and promotes Syrian stability. Now I will turn it over to Nate Jones, a rebel expert, to explain why local rebel forces should not be a part of that pathway, and to outline a strategy towards them moving forward.
Good afternoon. My name is Nate Jones, and I'm here to talk about the state of non-state actors in Syria and why the second plank of our policy platform that Zoe mentioned, completely eliminating funding to rebels, is essential to any U.S. policy in the region. The first reason is that the rebels are not necessary for the fight against the Islamic State. The most effective forces in our fight against ISIS have been the Kurds, namely the YPG, a set of Kurdish militias that form the core of the Syrian Democratic Forces in the north of Syria. We fund and arm the YPG and in return have gotten a secular army capable of fighting ISIS. Unfortunately, for both military and regional concerns, we believe they will be less effective in the future. In terms of military concerns, the YPG is reaching the upper bounds of its effectiveness. As it moves south around the ISIS capital of Raqqa, Kurdish forces are leaving traditionally Kurdish territory towards Arab regions. Ethnic homogeneity has helped the YPG effectively administer its regions throughout the conflict thus far. The demography of Raqqa, and as they move south towards Deir al-Zor, threatens the YPG's effectiveness. Experts worry that a YPG-controlled Raqqa would create space for jihadist insurgency, in part because of a concern about Kurdish overextension. Additionally, the continued push southward from the YPG will likely increase Turkish attacks on it, making it more vulnerable. While the Kurds have been a valuable ally, they have also reached their effective military limit in Syria, meaning that we should cut formal ties to continue the fight against ISIS further, using the power of regional actors as Jesse described. Part of the reason why that's true is because of the regional aspect of the YPG and their relationship with the Turks. In terms of regional concerns, the YPG shares intimate connections with the PKK, a terrorist group in Turkey that Turkey has legitimate concerns about, and that those concerns extend to the YPG. Given the importance of Turkey in countering Iran, balancing Russia, and fighting jihadists, the U.S. needs its support. The country is both a NATO ally and too essential to U.S. interests in the region to continue antagonizing. Ultimately, continued funding and supply of the YPG does not yield enough military gain to justify the sustained fraying of our relationship with Turkey. But we should not end funding to the group unilaterally. Instead, the U.S. must ask that Turkey do its part in contributing to the fight against the Islamic State, including the provision of ground troops if necessary, and also that Turkey continue accepting refugees and providing humanitarian aid to the 3 million refugees already within its borders. Continued funding of the Kurds is a low-cost bargaining chip to use until we convince Turkey to support U.S. goals. The second issue for the United States is a choice. We can either cut ties with rebels or indirectly fund jihadists. Relying upon the moderates of the Free Syrian Army is now impossible. The complex set of groups that defined the beginning of the conflict has morphed into a smaller arrangement of groups de facto dominated by jihadists. Namely, al-Nusra, which began as the Al-Qaeda branch in Syria, has formally renounced that role but retains its informal connections. In January of this year, it formed a larger coalition with other groups, including groups that were previously explicitly nationalistic, called Tahrir al-Sham. That group remains listed as a terrorist organization by our State Department and is on the United Nations Security Council sanctioned list and has been since 2014. The overlap of locations, interconnected web of formal and informal relationships, and shared goals of many of these Syrian rebel groups means that funding one of them inherently requires funding radical groups with interests opposed to our own. The dominance of jihadists among Sunni rebel groups makes them a danger to U.S. interests. The funding of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan and subsequent turning of those groups into the core of al-Qaeda should give us pause as we consider funding the Syrian rebels. Providing aid to any group of Sunni rebels must keep in mind the arms willingly turned over from U.S.-funded moderates to Nusra Front militias. Groups that don't willingly join with jihadists are often attacked by them for being affiliated with the United States, as happened with Jaish al-Tahrir in 2015. U.S. funding and training ultimately hurts American interests while providing arms that inflame the conflict. President Trump's decision yesterday to end CIA funding to rebels is a good start. The United States Department of Defense should continue it. Third, and I think perhaps most importantly for understanding why funding more rebel groups isn't a solution, is the fact that the continued funding poses challenges to regional stability. The various axes on which the Syrian conflict can be mapped, as a conflict between the Kurds and the Turks, between Sunnis and Shias, Iran and Saudi Arabia, the United States and Russia, and many more, all means that the funding of groups prompts the counter-funding from other groups instead. The Turks funded Sunni rebels to attack the Kurdish as part of Operation Euphrates Shield last year. U.S.-funded rebels' gains in 2015 are what prompted Russia's direct military intervention into the conflict. When Iran funds different proxy groups, it's in response to Gulf funding of other proxy groups. The addition of more funding of rebels prompts escalatory responses. This self-balancing equilibrium means that funding Syrian rebels sufficiently enough to defeat Assad is impossible. The United States should escape this escalatory framework in Syria, which endangers civilians, stokes violence, and accomplishes nothing by ending rebel funding. Fourth, the state of rebel groups makes the division of Syria impossible. There's the challenge of convincing different warring groups to come from this mess of a map into a single, neat zone as outlined in other proposals. Any form of partition or confederation is further undermined by the lack of a unified, moderate rebel force with whom to cooperate. The current configuration of Sunni rebels, as I mentioned, is infiltrated by jihadists, meaning that giving territory to them inherently requires working with the partners of terrorists. Additionally, a partition requires internal respect for the authority of the new government, which does not exist because many of these groups are not recognized internally as legitimate. This cannot be solved by merely destroying terrorist groups. Even if extremists are removed from power, their supporters and ideology remain. The Iraq War testified to the dangers of insurgency even after we've established a government in the area. Additionally, when the U.S. has tried to elevate rebel groups to the status of challengers to Nusra Front or Assad, those groups have been specifically targeted by jihadist rivals. The international community's choice of a group as leaders of a Sunni partition zone would amount to the placing of a target on the back of a new government. Without groups amenable to U.S. interests in administering territory and possessing legitimacy, any peace would require significant investment in external peacekeeping forces, and any partition would be temporary. These four aspects of non-state groups, that ISIS can be fought without rebel help, that the dangerous connections between rebel funding and jihadists endangers U.S. interests, that increased funding intensifies regional conflict, and that in addition to the challenges non-state actors pose to a partition or division of the country, offers a way forward for the United States. We must work to avoid funding rebels and combat the Islamic State, which will simplify the conflict and decrease the risk of regional escalation. Only after doing that can we look for a diplomatic solution to the conflict. At this point, I'll turn it over to Rebecca Van Pammel, our regional expert, to talk about current regional relationships and how our plans are going to affect those relationships.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Syria A's regional expert, and I will explain current regional dynamics shaping U.S. action and provide a roadmap to the actions the U.S. should take to pursue greater stability in the region. There are 3 facts which we need to consider to understand the current alignments within the Syrian conflict and build a diplomatic strategy that attains greater stability within the region. The first is that the current trajectory of our diplomatic strategy within the region is putting us on a path towards a nightmare scenario by not sufficiently accounting for 3 factors: the Sunni-Shia divide, facing off with a Russia that will not back down, and upsetting our allies. Second, within my broader framework is the fact that diplomacy and de-escalation are the only paths that have any chance of fostering regional stability and supporting other interests in the long term. The third is that the United States has sufficient diplomatic leverage on the basis of our strong ties to certain actors and inherent interests of our adversaries to achieve de-escalation and greater regional stability. Sunni and Shiite factions continue to play out their regional rivalry across the Middle East. This includes the current conflict in Syria, which has become a potent symbol both for Saudi Arabia and Iran. The conflict's sectarian dynamic explains the commitment from other nations in the region to fighting the war. This is why Saudi Arabia continues to advocate for regime change, and it's why Iran is funding pro-government forces to protect the minority Alawite government. Our current involvement in the conflict is on course to further entrench these divides. Alongside the Saudis, we are supporting Sunni rebels to fulfill a political goal. We must understand, however, that because rebels are acting along religious lines as Saudi proxies, our aid is simply exacerbating diplomatic relations in a sectarian conflict, risking the loss of the nuclear deal with Iran along the way. All of this comes with little gain to justify the risk. To make matters worse, we are also on course to destroy any chance of cooperation with Russia against ISIS, and in fact complicate the situation in the region by getting entangled in a proxy conflict of our own against Putin. We want to demonstrate through the examples of Russian pushback that Jesse provided earlier, that if we take bolder action against Assad than we have already taken, then already frayed U.S.-Russian relations could snap. The Syrian conflict is one that cannot be solved without involving Russia. However, we are at a juncture right now where we can decide whether we want Russian involvement to be with us or against us. Within the Syrian conflict, we have also upset relations with Turkey. By funding the Kurds, as Nate mentioned earlier, we are damaging our relations with this country. Additionally, given Turkey's recent realignment with Assad in the interest of promoting regional stability above regime change, our current goal of regime change in Syria now upsets not only Iran and Russia, but also Turkey. Continuing the status quo threatens the risk of allowing a civil war whose actual outcome has relatively little impact on U.S. interests to come between us and a valuable ally. So the risks of staying on our current course are high. The risks of intervening more strongly to destabilize the regime are also high, as Jesse and Nate have spoken to. The only path to stability that leaves us is direct, cooperative diplomatic outreach with the explicit goal of de-escalation, no matter the outcome for Assad. We must therefore contend with tensions between Iran and Saudi Arabia, the Kurds and Turkey, the United States and Russia, all to create this broader goal of attain this broader goal of stability, all with a different set of mechanisms altogether from the invasions of years past. We do, however, have sufficient leverage to encourage these diverse actors engaged in these diverse conflicts to act in accordance with American interests. They include the cessation of rebel funding, the manipulation of pre-existing national interests of involved states, the power to continue or discontinue arms sales to regional actors at will, and the provision of additional humanitarian aid to refugee hosting states. We have spoken a lot today about the far-reaching military benefits and underlying justification for no longer funding rebel groups. Cessation of rebel funding addresses tensions for multiple regional actors, including Russia, Iran, and Turkey. Instead of unnecessarily digging ourselves into a sectarian conflict through rebel funding, we must instead work with Saudi Arabia and Iran on other facets of the conflict, like combating ISIS, in the hopes of brokering some precedent for cooperation on which they could build. Working together in this way is an option that is necessarily excluded by the United States' current arming of rebel forces. Additionally, not all opposition of Iranian expansionism within the Middle East needs to involve rebel fighting in Syria. President Trump announced Tuesday morning that he would be increasing sanctions against Iran related to Iran's adherence to the recent nuclear deal. We clearly have other mechanisms of showing Iran that we will not accept actions contrary to the U.S. interests or the interests of our allies, while not further complicating an already convoluted Syrian crisis. Additionally, if the United States stops actively opposing Russia's pro-government forces within Syria, Russia's willingness to help the United States will improve dramatically. We can offer an end to rebel funding as a clear signal that we are ready to work with Russia on defeating ISIS. And we thus avoid the complication of an all-out war or proxy war with Russia, bolster our counterterrorism measures, and set a precedent for working with Putin on regional stability measures that will be invaluable in dealing with future issues, particularly with regards to Iran, who are closely allied with Russia. We do acknowledge, however, that not all of Russia's interests are agreeable, and we need to be careful working with them, even if we have no choice but to do so. Further, if we stop funding the Kurds, we can gear towards a relationship with Turkey in which we can count on them to cooperate on ISIS fighting and refugee protection. We will no longer be on the opposite side of this conflict from our ally and no longer risk facing a Turkey which not only opposes us, but has also grown closer to Russia due to their cooperation in protecting Assad. Direct action aside, we also have a unique opportunity at this point in the conflict to co-opt each state's own self-interest to our benefit. One of the major actors in the region with whom this strategy will work is Russia. It is important to realize that both countries, both the United States and Russia, know that arming and helping different actors to the point of outright war with one another in Syria is only prolonging the conflict, increasing both casualties and cost. Putin also has a notable interest in power projection and currently faces a St. Petersburg which has been bombed by ISIS and a citizenry that has been plagued by defections to ISIS. The situation is an opportunity for the United States to co-opt Russia's inherent interest in fighting terrorism for the benefit of our own cause in the region, seizing this unique chance to build goodwill. Recent events have also given us leverage to counter any Saudi backlash at the drawback of American rebel funding. Relations with Saudi Arabia are at an all-time high point right now. And the United States also has a pending sale of $110 billion in weapons to Saudi Arabia. It is likely that we can negotiate with Saudi Arabia over which rebel groups they continue to fund using this and any future arms deals as leverage. This could thus extricate the United States from the murky situation we are currently in, wherein we have allied ourselves with a state sponsor of extremism. I will now turn it over to Zoe to both talk about the impact the further provision of humanitarian aid will have on stability in the region and provide some closing remarks.
Working towards stabilization is a crucial component of our proposal, but it is not enough in and of itself. We also have to help mitigate the consequences of the conflict and alleviate the tremendous human suffering it has caused. The United States cannot sit back while millions of Syrian civilians suffer and are driven away from their homes. It is also in our national security interest to help secure the refugee camps to prevent them from becoming a breeding ground for extremism. Military intervention would only escalate the conflict, making even more victims and increasing the flow of civilians fleeing the country. Now that we have explained to you why diplomacy, not military intervention, is the best US approach to the Syrian conflict, we will present the final essential part of our proposal, humanitarian help. The Syrian refugee crisis has been one of the worst humanitarian disasters of the century. According to the UNHCR, over 5.1 million refugees have already fled the country. Most of them concentrate in surrounding countries such as Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey, where they are grouped in camps close to the Syrian borders and lack basic requirements such as food, shelter, healthcare, and education. As many as 90% of these refugees live below the poverty line. Jordan and Lebanon, the two neighboring countries most affected by the crisis, are struggling to provide the necessary help, overwhelmed by the never-ending flow of refugees. This is where the US help would be the most effective, to help them secure their borders with Syria, increase and streamline the inflow of refugees, and help provide refugee camps with basic utilities. The US has provided $5 billion over the past 6 years to help these countries in their humanitarian efforts. We think that number should be tripled over the next few years. By tripling funding to Jordan and Lebanon, who have each welcomed around 1 million refugees so far, we are ensuring that they will be able to better respond to the refugee crisis and contribute to stability in the region. First, this would allow them to both increase the amount of refugees they accept and improve the quality of life of the refugees they host. Second, it will help them improve broader security and more effectively vet the people coming into their refugee camps. This will be critical in containing the fight within Syria's borders. For example, it would prevent Assad-backed forces from pursuing rebels into neighboring countries and prevent ISIS from infiltrating refugee camps to carry out radicalization campaigns. We also intend to offer a robust increase of our funding to Turkish refugees, of whom there are over 3 million. Turkey will be more inclined to cooperate with American humanitarian efforts within their borders as a result of our new policy towards the Kurds and towards Assad. The US should also directly aid the Syrian civilians through airlifts. This will be more effective than trying to work through the UN, often ineffective in responding to the crisis due to both its inability to collaborate with non-state actors and the fact that the supplies are often intercepted by the Assad government, never reaching the populations in need. On top of the obvious humane interest that the US has in providing help to refugees, we can also see that it is in the US national security interest, because discontented refugees are the exact people that ISIS would try to target and enroll in their rank. Realism and compassion are not mutually exclusive. In fact, such approaches often intersect. To conclude, we recognize that, like any policy, this proposal is imperfect. We recognize that by not decisively opposing Assad, we are risking him staying in power. However, we also know that any direct US involvement in the conflict will prolong the war and the humanitarian crisis, rather than end it. We cannot afford to create another Iraq or Libya quagmire, and the beleaguered Syrian people cannot afford to face one. We cannot afford to risk American lives and critical diplomatic relationships over a crisis that is relatively peripheral to American interest. Instead, we need to step back from the conflict, focusing on our national interest of regional stability and counterterrorism, while cooperating with pertinent actors. Focusing our military efforts on the fight against ISIS is the most concrete, economical, and efficient pathway to stabilizing the region and preventing any form of escalation. That does not mean forgetting about refugees in need, for our plan will provide them with much-needed support and place them at the heart of the US humanitarian effort. Ultimately, we see the outcome of the conflict as something peripheral to US interest, which is why the US has to back down from it. But with this policy, we are protecting direct American security interest by helping maintain broader regional security, as well as acting to provide help to the Syrian populations, the most affected by this conflict. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Team A. Okay, questions? Who'd like to get us started? Chris?
Okay, well done. And I'll say you convinced me in terms of the dangers of escalation and really the futility of arming rebels. I agree with that. And that we should focus on the Islamic State. How do you respond to the point that while you recommend diplomacy, which I concur with, we need to work to try to get to an interim accord, the proposal lacks vision and detail on how to get there. So, the situation on the ground is that all these various actors are all pursuing their number one priority. And we're grinding. No, we're not getting anywhere. It's prolonged. And this has festered, and it has provided a safe haven for the Islamic State. Just as they gained when Libya became a failed state, that really helped regenerate Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which just rebranded themselves the Islamic State, even had the same leader, and then jumped back in to Syria when they had that opportunity. So I think you provide a lot of very helpful insights and some good direction, but I wonder how you respond that how do we get these various elements and entities to come off their number one priority, knowing that even if they don't get their number one, they could get their number two if we all work together?
I think that the biggest reason why, we think that within this plan, different actors which have independent interests of their own would be willing to work with one another is that the United States' involvement at this point has been just an aggravating factor, an extreme aggravating factor, by putting a major world power in the middle of a conflict where relatively minor regional interests are at play. So we believe that by removing that extreme aggravating factor, we will simplify the conflict and simplify the pathway to either primary or secondary interests of the regional actors who are at play, including Iran, who we mentioned their ongoing path towards the Mediterranean to create this land arc, Saudi Arabia, who would love to bolster Sunni influence within the region. But we believe that combating ISIS itself is a unified enough goal that we could use this as an opportunity to set a precedent for a cooperation that could open up potentially to future negotiations or a less aggravated situation of interaction with one another down the road. Now, if you notice, we haven't presented any kind of concrete endgame of we want this actor to offer, we want Saudi Arabia to offer this concession to Iran to allow the Alawite government to have this status, because we believe that that should be something that is up to the regional actors' own negotiations, and we believe that that will all depend on the outcome of this conflict, which we cannot predict because we are not outwardly going for one side or the other. However, we believe that this relative neutrality that offers us gives us the ability to potentially act as a guarantor of whatever agreement they could reach in the future, or potentially broker these negotiations themselves.
Well, that's interesting. I appreciate that.
Let's turn to Josh. We'll come back to some of these points.
Sure. So I have a sort of practical question. You're talking about stabilizing areas in eastern Syria, and delivering humanitarian aid. Who's going to do that? Who are the men with guns that are going to protect and govern these cities?
Some women with guns, too.
Who are going to be the convoys that deliver this? If not U.S. military, who?
Yeah, so just one thing to clarify. We were not, in terms of airlifts, we believe that U.S. forces will drop aid, but otherwise most of our aid is going to Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey in terms of humanitarian assistance. And that, because while we want to provide humanitarian assistance, we think it's challenging to do it. And part of the reason we chose airlifts is because we think putting U.S. forces in the region would have issues with the fact that they would essentially be involved in conflict while delivering humanitarian aid, and we don't want to start that. So instead, we're just going to provide it outside the country, and then airlifts where we think we can provide targeted aid to populations.
Well, we were certainly not trying to provide ground support, troop support to secure certain cities or anything like a safe zone. Our goal is to help the refugees that are in Jordan and Lebanon, help them secure their borders, to bring in refugees, provide more humanitarian assistance, help out Turkey as well. But we're certainly not looking to create anything like a safe zone within the actual region.
Okay, but this is a humanitarian nightmare ongoing within the country, not just in the camps. So are you trusting that some outside power like Saudi is going to rule in?
So I think with the Saudis, obviously, I mean, they've been very mellifluous in the past. It's been difficult to read what their intentions are. And right now what you're seeing is a new wave of Saudi power rising with Mohammed bin Salman, who is actually the youngest defense minister in the world before being just promoted to crown prince. And bin Salman has had a very different type of rhetoric from different Saudi leaders in the past. He's obviously been very aggressive in Yemen. He's been very aggressive with the Qatar situation. And he also has an influence on the U.S. It's his brother, actually, Khalid bin Salman, that's been promoted to the ambassador from Saudi to the U.S. So I think that with the Saudi Arabians, there's a potential to really establish an outstanding new working relationship with them right now. And I think that could the Saudis provide ground troops? Potentially, could we use the Saudis as a broker in this conflict? Absolutely.
But to the specific point of providing humanitarian aid, because we recognize that their plan seems to present this really attractive option of safe zones within the country, because we've seen images from within, say, Aleppo, where there are obviously horrific things happening to the populace there. However, we believe that the presence of the United States to create such safe zones would be such an aggravating factor that it would actually prolong the war and lead to more devastating human costs than the more natural and less complicated situation with the United States looking on from the outside. So we believe that while we don't provide this immediate, more attractive option that side B is trying to promise, we believe that we actually have the ability to fulfill the humanitarian aid directly to refugees who are a large part of the populace whom we can relatively simply reach, and we believe that this conflict will end much sooner without the United States complicating it.
What's going to happen? Oh. Yep.
A couple of observations and a question. A couple of very important elements that weren't mentioned at all. One is the price of oil and gas. Oil and gas represents the fuel that takes this region out of the realm of, tribal, unreal countries, shifting borders, constant war, and takes it into the realm of incredibly important geopolitical forces. And I think when we're searching in this particular discussion for solutions to the Syrian situation, I think front and center, there were a lot of ideas thrown around by both sides. Front and center is ideas that would keep the price of oil and gas down and push it further down. It's been the fuel that has fueled the Islamic radical madrasas throughout the world, this protection racket that the Gulf states have had going for 40 years, where they send the money out and then their countries aren't attacked by terrorists. And also, the money has gone into what we all know as not only lavish living, but all kinds of instruments of violence, rather than building solid and broad, prosperous society. So keep the money, get the money flow to go down. Second element is the difficulty of neither side mentioned the difficulty of predicting things here. I saw the word ISIS 45 times, I wasn't counting, up on the board, both sides. Did anyone hear that word, 5 years ago? It didn't exist. And I saw the word allies, and I saw Saudi Arabia, Qatar. Wow,
Big ass airbase.
Wow, there's Erdogan sitting next to the president.
Big one there too.
The difficulty of making predictions of who's going to be an ally on Tuesday, and is that country or person or tribe or gang or militia going to be an ally on Wednesday? I would think that that's at the top of the list as a sort of a. I was listening for somebody to say, well, I understand, whoever you are, that this is an exercise and this is what we're supposed to be doing, but let's all admit that it's very, very difficult to make predictions, and therefore a spirit of humility and caution about solutions and programs seems to be at the top. So my question is, for either side, but this is part of the discussion for these guys and gals, what would stability look like? What is a steady state stability in that, quote, country, close quote, actually look like?
So the logic of unpredictability is pretty strongly embedded within our project. It's why we're not trying to intervene for either side of the conflict. It's why we won't openly support Assad to end the war right now. It's why we won't openly oppose Assad to get him out of power. It's why we want to take out ISIS right now, because it looks like they're fledgling, instead of let them fizzle out on their own, because we understand that through the example of Al-Qaeda, that doesn't happen. They don't just fizzle out on their own. They require strong intervention to get them out of the way. But I think that providing a prediction of what exactly stability looks like involves going against this idea of unpredictability. So I don't know what sort of agreement Iran could reach with Saudi Arabia if they had some sort of precedent for cooperation under their belt on which to base some sort of talk regarding potentially Iran's expansionist goals, regarding potentially Saudi Arabia's own expansionist goals. So we haven't provided some image of exactly who's going to be aligned with whom at the end of this, because obviously Turkey has proven to us that even after 5 years fighting for one side of the war, it's possible to jump in on the other side and start fighting for Assad, even though you had been previously creating the Free Syrian Army, who were for years the main force against Assad. But I believe that by creating a pathway through this plan to set up the possibility of negotiations, we are opening it up to a stability that right now is not possible, and through strong military intervention would not be possible. Because if we don't do something to broker Sunni-Shia divides and we actually just jump in on one side and intensify them, then there is no solution, certainly within the near future, possibly within any future. And with regards to your point about the price of oil, we believe that with our robust cooperation with Saudi Arabia, as Jesse so helpfully outlined with his answer to Professor Rovner's question, we will be able to get one of the main oil producing countries within the region further on our side, allow them to take this action against ISIS that they've been gearing up to do for 3 years now by offering their ground troops, and saying, hey, we recognize that you are a main regional power. Now go and use your power as this regional influence to take down a major threat to your country.
I'm going to have to stop you there. Aaron?
What's going to happen in Raqqa?
If we're being honest, the SDF is likely going to take Raqqa in the near future.
And then we're going to cut funding?
So our plan, yes, does involve cutting funding because we think that we're reaching a breaking point with Turkey. We think that the release recently of the location of U.S. forces by Turkish state-run media indicates that if we want their support and the way that we've built our fight against the Islamic State has relied upon Turkey, we need to end funding to the Kurds. I also think that
What does it look like if Turkey gets back on side?
What it looks
Where
like...
does that get us?
What?
What does that get us?
We think ground forces, we also think that they protect refugees better than they are now. They continue accepting them for humanitarian purposes. And then also, I think that...
But are they really going to do anything against ISIS? I mean, their track record is crap, right?
So I think that's partly why it's contingent, our dropping of aid. I think that the SDF has the power to hold the ground they already have, and that allowing them to do so, like with or without U.S. aid, so we would allow them to do so. But we're also not going to take away funding from them until Turkey agrees to stop targeting the Kurds and agrees to start targeting the Islamic State, in part because we think that our support has made it so that the PKK and YPG can focus both on Turkey and Syria. And so we do have that leverage over them.
Turkey has had such a heated rivalry with the Kurds for so long that we think it's just very difficult for them to fully jump on board with any U.S.-led anti-ISIS initiatives when the U.S. is still so heavily funding the Kurds.
Yeah, but they weren't on board with any anti-ISIS initiatives before we were funding the Kurds, right? They had a totally porous border and, in fact, basically provided sanctuary to ISIS and encouraged a lot of anti-Assad attacks for the first 3 years of the conflict, right? I mean, if anything, they poured gasoline on this thing more than anything else. So I'm a little bending over backwards for Turkey on that front, I guess I would say. Given the logic that you guys have sort of laid out, why not just de-escalate and disengage from this entirely? Let the Saudis deal with ISIS. Let Iran in the regime figure it out with ISIS. Full on take our ball and go home, if it's our presence and our activities that have so inflamed the region.
Because while we understand that the actual outcome of this conflict itself, with regards to which our intervention would be the most harmful, are relatively periphery to U.S. interests, the potential fallout of an outcome that doesn't involve any sort of U.S. influence could be worse for the stability of the region. So if we're not involved in some way trying to oversee and sort of manage how these regional ties could play out, then we could end up with far worse situations, especially between Saudi Arabia and Iran, who are also currently at war with each other as proxies in Yemen and other places within the region. So we believe that just stepping out and letting it burn can sound kind of attractive in the short term, because then we're not having to be concerned at all about it. But we think that in the long term, that could lead to really costly escalation between Saudi Arabia and Iran particularly, and really damaging humanitarian costs if we're not staying present to provide some sort of aid for them.
And we also just can't ignore ISIS, given that, I mean, anti-American rhetoric is a huge part of their campaign, and this is a group that is actually threatening American civilians.
I think that one thing that both teams, and it's not surprising given that we're doing American policy recommendations, is We can neither provide as much of the solution as I think Team B would like, nor we are as much of the problem as Team A can identify. And that's the, I'm a control freak by nature. That both those things drive me crazy, and so that's part of the challenge of this particular region.
If only we had a Team C. One last question. I'm going to give Team B one quick opportunity to ask a question of Team A.
So I had a question for you guys. So one of the big elements of your policy is humanitarian aid, right? But Assad has been responsible for 70% of civilian casualties in all of Syria for the past 6 years. He's done some terrible things in Aleppo and the entire country, to be honest. So isn't not addressing Assad kind of going counter to your humanitarian aspect of your policy?
That's over.
Well, we believe that right now what we're doing to go against Assad is funding the rebels, and that the only thing that is doing is prolongating the war and the conflict. It's becoming clearer and clearer that Assad is going to win whatever we do, and that and so doing what we're doing now and keeping and trying to counter him is only making more victims and making people suffer for a longer period of time. And we think that the best solution right now is to just let the conflict come to its natural end and help the refugees and the people that have already suffered enough from it.
Additionally, whatever you can say about Assad during wartime and Assad during peacetime was responsible for far fewer civilian casualties than we could account for in the United States effort by funding rebel proxies to take out Assad. So we believe that the cost of having him in power in a peacetime situation where he's won the civil war and now they're in an effort to rebuild, we think will be lower than this prolonged conflict that Zoe has alluded to.
Okay, just a few things real quick. I'd obviously like to thank all of our teams today. I think they did a wonderful, wonderful job. I'd like to thank all of our experts. Obviously, I'd like to once again thank the singers. I'd like to thank Dave Dewey, by the way, for all of his support. I think Dave has seen about 6 or 7 of our presentations, which is definitely a Williams College record, and he's here all the time. I want to thank all of our visitors. There's one person who I haven't thanked yet, though, who really deserves a great amount of credit, and I know the students know this, but I just want him to know that we all know it. Jack Greenberg has just done a tremendous job. I know we probably left a fair amount of questions on the table, but you know what? We're all going to be in the same room having dinner together, so hopefully we can continue this conversation over dinner. We'll be at the faculty club in the basement at 6:30. If you get there a little early, that's not a problem either. We'll all be there. Okay, thank you very much, and enjoy the day. Oh, last thing, obviously, Keith, great job, and appreciate it. Thanks.